Hey everyone. So, the difference between what it is to be woke and what it is to be awakened came up as a question in a conversation the other day. And I've been thinking about it and I got a little bit of a download and I'd like to share that with you today. So, I have some notes written here. The difference between being woke and being awakened. So, first of all, what does it mean to be awakened or to be in the process of awakening, right? When we talk about awakening or being in the process of being an awakening, there that does not imply a superiority or a better than, because everybody is always in sort of different layers and different levels of that process. And you can even kind of go real far with certain levels of awakening and then sort of fall back to sleep for a little bit. I've done that many times in my lifetime. And so, first and foremost, there always needs to be a certain degree and foundation of compassion within that and understanding of the human condition and that it's not really a race and it's not really a competition, but that, there's a point where you realize that you'd like to be awake from moment to moment. And so, what does that mean? So, being awake or being in the process of awakening means that you're practicing being as conscious as you can be from moment to moment. Your conscious awareness is in the driver's seat. So, in this process, much of your subconscious and your unconscious, and then even your superconscious, become a part of your conscious mind. So, like I said, this kind of happens in layers too. So, when you first start practicing being conscious, and some people call it being mindful, right? First, it's just coming into the present moment and practicing that, right? You practice through concentration. You might practice through watching the breath. You might practice through concentration through mantra. You might practice through studying nature and observing your reality. You might practice through consciously observing the sensations in your body. But as you practice this more and more, your awareness will start to spread and expand into these deeper layers of your mind. So you start to become aware of these barely perceptible narratives, inner narratives is usually how it starts. Or it could be that you start to feel into sort of your pain body. It might not be something in the mind so much as something you sense and feel in your sort of emotional imprinting. And that's kind of how it started for me. I didn't see my beliefs first off, my repressed unconscious beliefs. I saw I started to feel into and lean into this inner cloud. It's like a pain body, but it was actually my repressed shadow self, right? So this is one of the first things that happens in awakening. And a lot of people kind of pursue enlightenment and illumination and pursue awakening from this kind of naive place, because we all want to feel free. We all want to feel illuminated. We think we do. We think we know what that is. But you start going down that path, oftentimes, especially after you have an initial kind of kundalini awakening, or you have an initial opening or visionary experience into something greater, something larger than yourself, you start to see these deeper, darker layers, right? So this includes like the subconscious and eventually unconscious mind. And there are a lot of different techniques and stuff to get into those layers and start integrating them. So eventually, through working through that material, through the trauma work, through just the integration of beliefs and bringing yourself back into center and wholeness, bringing the fragments back in, you start to expand even more so into a more super conscious mind. So the process of integrating the shadow self and the trauma leads you naturally into a process of almost kind of mastery, especially if you do this right and you do it with the meditation, you do it with the yoga, you do it with the energy mastery. It comes kind of through the experience of integrating the shadow self, the unconscious mind, the trauma. So eventually you expand into this super conscious mind, which then translates as a more expanded awareness of not only the collective mind, but the field directly, the energy field, the fabric of reality that underlies everything, right? So the fabric of nature, even you could call it. So you start to practice being conscious and in the driver's seat. You slowly expand into your kind of shadow. You start to integrate that. You integrate your traumas. You face all this stuff directly. You face this stuff with complete awareness, present moment awareness. Then you expand into this sort of collective mind, the super conscious mind. And the way that you do that is by this, you get an awareness of your different energy bodies. It's your etheric body, right? That's going to connect your physical perception, your physical self with these greater realities, the greater mind, the superconscious mind, the unconscious, the field outside yourself connected from within. So in the process of awakening, you're actually becoming more and more aware, and in some ways more in control of yourself, more in conscious. You're in the driver's seat, so you actually make choices and decisions based on a lot more information than somebody who hasn't had an awakening yet, maybe isn't aware of certain aspects of their energy system. Maybe they're not even aware of their internal sensations. So they're not aware of their trauma and their learned behaviors, and why certain, how that translates into karma, and like why certain things create certain consequences, right? So in the process of awakening, you awaken to your individual unconscious mind and eventually to the collective unconscious mind. And through this process, most will come to shed a lot of trauma as well as programmed ideology individually, as well as, this is the next part, awaken to the ideologies that drive societies, religious dogma, and culture that are not rooted in conscious awareness. So through the process of this sort of individual awakening and then expanding into this collective mind and the greater field, you start to really wake up to first how yourself, how I am or was previously driven by automatically driven by ideology. And so you start to see that in society as a whole, and you start to have to deconstruct what not only your parents taught you, but what society taught you and reinforced, right? And there are a lot of lies at the foundation of a lot of that. There are a lot of mistruths, there are a lot of half-truths. There's a lot of really disempowering stuff. And one of the things that you get to on that path of awakening is this sense of personal power and responsibility that comes through the process when you start to realize that you can deconstruct and reconstruct these belief systems and these ideologies. You can actually integrate and heal your trauma, wake up, plug in to the greater source, and become a channel for pure creative energy, basically. And And when you start waking up to this stuff, you realize you're capable of a whole hell of a lot more than everyone told you all your life. So this is kind of like my experience of the process of awakening, and part of what I guide others through in my sessions. So in the process of awakening, you slowly move from this sort of automatic driving force, which is your trauma, your belief structures, all the complexes of your ego that were constructed by family and society, the greater ideologies that were passed down through society. You start to move from being automated, basically, to being driven consciously by what I call the soul self. Some people have a problem with the word soul. It's just conscious awareness. It's just conscious awareness. Okay. You're not being automatically driven by belief structures. You may choose, in this whole process, you may actually get down to the core of your sort of ego and what it's built on, and choose new value structures, or re-choose the old ones, but now you're conscious of what they are and why they drive you. And you're conscious in each moment of the actions you're taking and what value that's coming from and why. So that's part of it too. So what is it to be woke in the modern derogatory sense of the word? And I just want to put it out there, like, I'm not talking about this to sow more division. I know we have tons of that already. But at the same time, I do think this is an important distinction in our modern conversation. And like I said, the question came up, someone asked me the question, and I wanted to get better at articulating like what the differences are. So it's not to sow division, it's not to create more polarization, and it's certainly not to say that one political ideology is somehow, I don't want to have that conversation. That's not what this conversation is about. Okay, this conversation is about the difference between really working on and practicing awakening and being woke in the modern sense of the word. So from what I've seen, being woke is quite the opposite of what I just described. The woke are often driven unconsciously by ideologies. And on top of that, these ideologies, like modern feminism, for example, are interlocked with one's traumas. So what does that mean? That means that there's some kind of inverted collective structure, collective mind structure. And it starts in the family, and not all families do it, but I've noticed that the ideological trauma-based driving structures, right, that latch on to these woke people are first disseminated through the family structure, and then that gets reinforced through academics, media, whatever, on and on, society. So what often happens, and maybe I'll just go into this now, what often happens, and this is what happened to me with feminism, what often happens is that the trauma happens in the family, right? And forms and develops the personality, the unconscious mind, the repressed mind of the child. And as the child grows up, if that stuff isn't healed and faced, then the teenager or the adult will look for ideologies to protect them, seemingly protect them, or give them sort of this false sense of power within the trauma. So when I woke up to the whole feminist lie, and I'm not talking about first stage, what is it? First wave feminism. I'm talking about like modern feminine, like what it is now and what it has become. One of the things I woke up to, and this was after I had healed so much trauma, but I still was unaware at a certain point of how this feminist ideology had latched on to my trauma as a woman that I had had with my father. And it wasn't even just with my father. It was so interesting. It was birth trauma. And it was actually, you know, to put it in a little nutshell, it was the ways in which I learned to cover up vulnerability, which is really the feminine in the child. And so there were these behavioral mechanisms that I learned with men and in conducting myself that were really extra armored, really hyper independent, really defensive, super defensive. And it clouded my vision. It was really kind of an automatic driver. And I started to wake up to it when I first realized, you know what, I'm really ready to settle down. I'm really ready to have a meaningful relationship with a man. And I realized that I was attracting men that had no masculine force in them. And if they did, then it wasn't grounded and stabilized. And I don't know if I'm clear. This is kind of like almost like a whole nother video. But I really got to see deep into my belief structure. And I saw how I had latched onto this feminist ideology to protect this trauma. And it was protecting my feminine. And in protecting that feminine, it was hiding it. And it was cutting off my creative force. And it was armoring me against being vulnerable with a man. And it was causing me to be in constant competition with men and with my partner. And when I started to see through that and let go of that, my life really started to change. That's when I really started to heal my attachment wounds. And when I actually started attracting men, because I was dating at the time, that weren't afraid to lead and be strong and stable and consistent. And anyway, maybe that's all I'll say about that. But it was a really huge shift, and I see that. So I see that now in the woke community. I see a lot of miserable women, to tell you the truth. Even women that maybe don't subscribe to the whole woke thing, they subscribe enough to this feminist ideology that they don't allow themselves to relax and receive with a man. They don't truly allow themselves to come into their feminine essence enough that they're really going to attract a man that will hold them. And there's nothing better than that feeling here on earth. So anyway, let's see where I was here. So these ideologies, they interlock with the individual's trauma. So these are collective societal ideologies that interlock with the individual's traumas, right? So then you have the idea that these ideologies are disseminated, and these narratives, these false narratives, are disseminated on purpose. So then that leads us to the idea that whole groups of people can actually be driven by these ideologies that are disseminated through academics, through Hollywood, through media, through society in general, right? And they think they're on a crusade, and they think they're going to save the world, and they think that, you know, they're fighting for social justice, and maybe they are in their own way. But when it's being automated or driven in this way, and it's not conscious, and the person isn't conscious of what's actually moving them from within, and they don't have that integrated, that's where you run into problems. That's where you run into this sort of exertion of force onto others and taking away of people's freedoms. That's where you run into these problems, because you're not actually a conscious co-creator yet. So another distinction to make, and I touched upon this with the awakening process. In the awakening process, you start to be really aware that you have a lot of power in a way, and a lot of responsibility. So even though you see problems in society, and you see, like everything I just described, how these things are being disseminated, and so how some of it's intentional, you start to realize that you can be an agent for change, without having to force other people with your will, right? So within the awakening process, you become an agent for change, first of all, from within. You change yourself first. You become as individuated, as liberated, as conscious as possible. And then when you become that agent for change, it's more like you're going to co-create something different, maybe even outside of these control mechanisms, right? You come into, like in my previous video talking about the soul purpose, you come into this soul purpose, and that becomes an agent for change. But you do not do that through forcing others against their will to give up their freedoms or do certain things, give up their bodily autonomy. So in the woke world, from what I've seen, the repressed shadow or unconscious mind is projected out into the outside world. So a lot of times when they're on these crusades, they're actually fighting with their own trauma, as it's projected onto others. So I've had many arguments back in the day with some of these people, and they're not really talking to me. They're not seeing me. They're not really seeing what I'm saying. They're seeing what the media told them. They're seeing what the narratives say, and they're seeing their own trauma. They're bumping up against their trauma as a projection in the outside world. So there's a really very prevalent victim consciousness. And that doesn't mean when I say victim consciousness, I'm not taking away from the fact that people are victims. People are victims of abuse. I was a victim of physical abuse. I understand that. I understand that children are victims. But there's a certain point where you realize there's a different way of realizing you're a victim and coming into awakening and empowerment with it, versus sort of blaming the world, the whole world for that, or blaming people who that doesn't really belong to. So oftentimes, just for example, feminism, or with a woman who's caught in her trauma with the feminist ideology, she will lash out at her man in a way that's really not his. It's probably her father's, or it's past lives, or it's just, kind of the woman's experience in society in general. She'll lash out at him and where he doesn't deserve it. So this is kind of the victim consciousness. So having said all that, I actually think that we have a lot of common ground. When I say we, I'm talking about me, defining myself as somebody who's in the active process of awakening, and the woke. I think we have tons in common. I actually think that a lot of their grievances with society are similar to mine. I think they're at the root, when you get down to the root, they're very similar. But the problem is that all of this stuff has been driven into polarization through false narratives, and it's been hyped up through fear and trauma. And so it's hard to even have a conversation that has any nuance left whatsoever about our common ground. Because I would say the common ground is we both pretty much are dissatisfied with the way the materialistic kind of society has been functioning, and we want to create something new. And I can get down with that, you know, and I wish that we could have bridged that gap. But what I've realized for myself now is that you can't win in a zero-sum game. You can't win in a totally polarized conversation. You have to be able to have nuance. You have to be able to suspend disbelief, you know, suspend your beliefs in some moments about these narratives, and how these narratives are sort of emphasized and overdrawn, I guess, because they're like half truths, a lot of them. So anyway, that's my little bit on the difference between being woke and awakened. A lot of nuance is lost in the polarization, divide and conquer agendas of the powers that want to be, right? So what I've noticed is a lot of the woke agent for action kind of stuff is driven by the powers that want to be. It's actually driven by ideologies and traumas that are not beneficial in the end to humanity. So that's my bit. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for listening. Sending lots of love.